We have three people here who have incredible insights but slightly differing perspectives, tactics, ways of dealing with what we're going to do. One of my hopes in the Rachel Carson Council for this event was to bring us together, to not have the separations between the grassroots and the big Washington guys, between the federal, the state, the local, the community, between civil disobedience and resistance and lobbying and advocacy. Somehow we got to put it all together. And so I'm just going to have Sandra Jean Karpinski, who you may know is the head of the League of Conservation Voters, and Carol Werner, who is the head of the Environmental and Energy Study Institute, which has been doing very serious work on renewables and energy, among other things. I'm going to let them say their piece. So let's start. Sandra, what in the world? What are we going to do? And then you all can chime in.
Well, I think, first of all, So we're confused about what to do. But so was Rachel Carson, actually. And just to illustrate this, it's always good to go back to her words, right? She dedicated Silent Spring to Albert Schweitzer, who said, "Man has lost the capacity to foresee and forestall. He will end by destroying the earth." And then, in the foreword to her book, she said this, "Finally, I must acknowledge our vast indebtedness to a host of people who first spoke out against the reckless and irresponsible poisoning of the world that man shares with all other creatures, and who are even now fighting thousands of small battles that in the end will bring victory for sanity and common sense to our accommodations to the world that surrounds us." So then 2 pages later, she predicts victory apparently brought about by a collection of grassroots activists. So I think Carson didn't even know what it is we should do. And so I think at this, I made the case, I think, in my formal remarks earlier today that we're not just going to get through this, as we did with the Reagan years or as Carson did with the Eisenhower years, in this kind of benighted, dark time of environmental unenlightenment and then to reemerge later on. We're way too close to the Albert Schweitzer moment. And so what do we do? So here's a few things that I'm thinking about these days. I mentioned one of them in my talk, which is direct action. Right now, today, we're following news not only from North Dakota, but further south along the Dakota Access Pipeline, where a small group of people have actually chained themselves to pipe drilling equipment. They're standing in water. At least the photographs I was able to take a look at, and are risking arrest. This is necessary work. It must continue, and I want each of you to look in your hearts and ask, what is it that you would be willing to go to jail for? What is so important to you? Is life itself rise to the moment that you would consider going to jail? My experience in jail is that actually I'm very well suited for it. It turns out I'm a really good prisoner. And I am a good prisoner because I'm a good cancer patient. I know how to deal with myself in confined spaces. I know how to walk down a hospital corridor, pushing an IV drip, holding closed my backless blue cotton gown, which means it turns out I have a skill set that makes me very good at wearing an orange jumpsuit and pushing and walking with ankle manacles and handcuffs up and down stairways. I found myself I could do that. So perhaps you have a skill set that would allow you to go to jail and sit in a cell for a while and use that time to reflect and to write and to read. If you're old enough, you also know how to write by hand. That's a good skill set to have while you're in jail. So think about that. And if there's something that would prevent you from doing that, then how can you support others who are doing that kind of direct action? Because when we can no longer appeal to laws, when we can no longer appeal to government, then it's not enough, I would say, especially for those of us who have the privilege of having data and knowledge about the direness of our situation. It's not enough to say, well, we knew, but we couldn't act, and there was nobody to act, so we did our best and then sit on the sidelines. So if the data don't speak, then our bodies have to speak. And so that's something I invite you to do some discernment around. Then there's the divestment movement, which is gaining power. So maybe we can go to the banks that are investing in projects that are going to kill the planet and kill our children. And we can say that we're taking our money out, we're taking our pensions out, we're taking our universities' endowments out, and so forth and so on. And so that's a movement for those folks who have money and that understand banking and financial systems and economic systems and work in that world. That's necessary work as well. Then there are the NGOs who have, I think, a particular role to play. You're out in the wilderness now. And so it's time to really reinvent what your mission is. And I'm just going to say, I feel personally sold out by the environmental NGO community in our successful victory in fighting fracking in New York, when we said, absolutely, there will be not one well in New York State. And the NGO community said, if you want a seat at the table, we'll talk about how to regulate fracking, but it's just an inevitability, and you need to accept that. We refused to accept it in the grassroots community, and we had to bring the NGOs along with us. But frankly, we had to fight a big fight with them that we should never have had to fight. I'm talking now about Environmental Defense Fund, who's working hand in glove with the fossil fuel industry. This is a very proud organization that carried out Rachel Carson's desire to see DDT banned, that helped ban PCBs, that said, our job is to sue the bastards, and now they're working hand in glove with the fossil fuel company. Shame on you, EDF. I'm talking about the Sierra Club, who accepted $25 million from the oil and gas industry before it turned down another $25 million, is having a hard time saying we need to ban fracking. Find your voice, Sierra Club. And I'm talking about the Natural Resources Defense Council, which found it necessary to endorse Hillary Clinton during the primary against Bernie Sanders, who was coming out strong against fossil fuels. So you're all now not associated with the power in this town. And it's time to find a new mission and align yourself with those who are doing direct action and who are out there on the front lines. That's my message to the NGOs. Finally, I think we can take an international approach. And that I learned while at the Paris climate talks last year. The move to reinvest in renewables and move money away from fossil fuels is already ongoing. We can strengthen that no matter what rules come out of the Capitol and come out of the White House. And we can do that by turning our own nation into a pariah if necessary, to do to the United States around energy what we had to do to South Africa around apartheid. If we are going to threaten the lives of children all over this globe, but especially in low-lying island nations and in places like Bangladesh, then the people who are making the decisions right there and in the White House have to be held accountable for it by the whole international community. If we need boycotts, if we need sanctions, if tourists are going to stop coming to our shores, then those are things that might need to happen, and we need to think about how we can put pressure on our own nation from the outside world if we end up occupied by a bunch of fossil fuel companies that are going to take us over the cliff. So those are my thoughts about what to do. I want to leave the last minute to Kaiulani. Please do. Please come. I want to just say a few words about what you just saw in Bangladesh. This is part of the international thing. Come on. Kaiulani Lee just returned from Bangladesh. Just say what you saw.
Thank you, Sandra. As an environmentalist in this community, in this country, I look through a Western lens, and my mind was blown by what I saw in Southeast Asia. I've been twice now doing research on climate change, and I would imagine that many of you who are interested in these issues would be as surprised as I was to make that lens wider. I had only heard about the ice caps in the Arctic. I was concerned, having traveled and spent a lot of time in Alaska. It hadn't occurred to me about the ice in the Himalayas. It hadn't occurred to me about the massive billions of people in China as their rivers were being cut off, India damming so that the rivers in northern Bangladesh are cut off. About a third of the rivers in Bangladesh no longer run to the Bay of Bengali. When I was in the bay last week, I saw islands that were islands of whole communities, and they were, they had 2 or 3 people on them with a cow. There was no land. And every fishing and farming village that I stayed in the Sundarbans, which is the largest mangrove forest in the world, every village I stayed in the course of 2 days, each village lost houses and or their road system. I was told that these were illiterate people who didn't even know anything about climate change. They know all about it. They're in the middle of it. And it's a wake-up call for those of us in the West, it was for me, to see that here's a country that has no industry. It just has sewing machines. And aside from the islands, it is to be the epicenter of climate change. So I just urge us to all look globally at this issue and not just at the globe and the planet, but to beginning to think of the billions of people and tigers and dolphins and fish, birds that are being affected everywhere. Thank you. That's just one thing.
Okay, so can you hear me? I can't stand behind the podium. Sorry. So I run the League of Conservation Voters. By the way, I appreciate that we didn't get a shout out, but we deserved it too. So I'm not going to try to spend next time apologizing for all my friends, but we all need to do better. I think that's the short answer to that, and I think all the things you talked about. We do 2 things a lot. We keep score. So every member of Congress has a score, and if you're in your state, there's a state LSV that get a score as well. And we do politics. And it's been 3 weeks and a day since the last big politics, and we can all let's just all be honest. It still sucks. Still get angry. I actually once a day do a primal scream. Sometimes when I wake up in the morning and I listen to NPR, or sometimes when I get home at night. But it's healthy. It's okay. And in the meantime, we have to get through it. We have to get through because we have a job to do, and we need to do it smarter and better, more strategically. I actually had the challenge of standing with some of my colleagues the day after the election. We always have a press conference the day after the election to talk about what happened, and we almost canceled it at midnight. But I think actually I'll give one of my colleagues said, no, we have to go. We have to just send a message about what this was about and what it wasn't about. So a few things just to remember about the politics. And I'll talk politics, that's what we do. So one is, unfortunately, this election was not about our issues. There was a conversation about immigration. There was a conversation about health care. We heard what Trump said about climate change, which was ridiculous and embarrassing. And he says but it wasn't part of the conversation. I blame the candidates, I blame the media, I blame us in part, but it was not part of the conversation. The good news of that is that therefore, it's not like there's some mandate that the public said we want to get rid of climate. We want to get rid of the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the Safe Drinking Water Act, the pest. There's no mandate to do that. In fact, the good news on that is the public is still absolutely on our side before the elections and after the elections. You want clean air, you want clean water, you want safe food, you want clean energy, you want to control carbon pollution, and they're yes, 60, 70, 80%. So there was no mandate. And the public's still on our side. So just keep repeating that and remember that. And it actually has the benefit of being true. But having the public on our side, as we know, isn't enough. And we just need to do much, much more than that. There are a lot of quotes you've heard today. I won't do all my Rachel Carson ones, but one of the favorite ones I've used almost every day since November 8th was Joe Hill. Don't mourn, organize. Don't mourn, organize. In all the ways you do that. In your local community, pooling resources to divest from things, as we heard, getting arrested as a group. The 1,200 people that got arrested down there in the White House, in front of the White House in August of 2011. That's why there's no Keystone Pipeline. It may be back, so we have to fight some more, but that's why that happened. So the strategies that we heard from Sandra and others have to happen locally and nationally. one of the things that we will try to do is, we're not going to make progress on climate at the national level in the next couple years. Let's be honest with ourselves. But what we have to do is make sure they don't take away all the tools that we have been using so that they remain in place in the future. And in the meantime, make progress at the local level. Mayors, governors, corporations, fight on all those levels to actually make progress. But at the national level, play the best damn defense we've ever played. I actually had the pleasure of being down in North Carolina 2 days before the election because that was a swing state. You've got a new, Hillary lost that state. Deborah Ross lost as a Senate candidate. You've got a new governor, knock on wood, 10,000 votes ahead. But he actually campaigned on clean air and clean water against a guy who's a national disgrace, Governor McCrory. So elections have consequences, and we didn't win. We lost a lot of elections. But there are a lot of good local stories where people turned out, organized, and a lot of local and statewide candidates won in key places. So remember that mantra. And you're going to hear from Sheldon Whitehouse in a second. So one shout out to him. So today, this week, he gave his 150th speech. Every week in Congress since back in April of 2012, he gives a speech on climate. So he's going to be a leader because when we're at the national, you make progress at the local level, progress with the corporations, progress at the city, governor, corporate level. And Congress got to play the best damn defense. We need champs in Congress. Sheldon's one of the best ones. And what we've talked about already with him and others is we need the biggest, big green firewall. They still have this crazy tool called the filibuster. We need 45 senators who are just going to lock arms every time they try to roll back the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, and say no. And so if we can at least protect those core laws that we have on the books and live to fight another day while we make progress locally, that's strategy number one now. So strategy number two is we need communication strategies on steroids. How do we best talk to each other effectively in ways that motivate people? And third is, the good thing about elections, there's always another one just around the corner. And so my friends who's from Virginia? The next big race is the governor's race in Virginia less than a year from now. You're going to have a sharp contrast between someone who thinks climate change is a real problem, who comes from Virginia Beach here and wants to solve it, and a climate denier. Sharp contrast there. In 2018, 36 governors around the country are going to be up. Who wins those races is going to determine whether we make progress in some of these big industrial states. So politics is always a challenge. They actually call the question, you win or lose, but there's always another election. It's up to us to organize locally to both win the policy fights, but also eventually win those political fights as well. So thanks. I know we have to take time for questions, so Carol, take it away.
Okay. Thanks, Steve. My name is Carol Werner with the Environmental and Energy Study Institute, and I first of all want to say thank you to Bob for organizing this wonderful forum today, and to all of the people who have spoken and the kind of leadership that you have been providing, which has been totally emotionally draining. It's been very inspiring, but thank you. And I want to take just a few minutes before our guest of honor comes tonight, Senator Sheldon Whitehouse, and because what I really want to convey to you in just a couple minutes that I think is so important, since we have come out of an election that I think has absolutely shaken most all of us to our core in terms of thinking about what does this mean, what do we do? And I think the key thing, and certainly in terms of my organization, the Environmental and Energy Study Institute, as we look at our heritage, we were started over 30 years ago by a bipartisan congressional caucus, set up as an independent nonprofit, but to provide to policymakers on both sides of the aisle, to provide to them solid, credible information on energy and environmental issues, challenges, get out the science, talk about how we can find good solutions that make common sense, that can address those issues and can provide multiple solutions to multiple problems that work together, that understand how our ecology, how our economy have to go hand in hand, and that if we do, we can address multiple problems, meet multiple objectives. And that I think that we have seen that. We have seen that in terms of of how, as we have worked on issues with a broad range of groups that come from NGOs, from the private sector, from the faith community, from even the finance sector in terms of thinking about insurance companies, from individuals across the country. What is very, very clear is, and you've heard this earlier today, what is very clear is that we know that the public does care about climate change. That is showing up very consistently in poll after poll by different pollsters and looking at every state. What we also know is that the public cares very much about clean energy. They care about clean air, they care about clean water, they love renewable energy. And clean energy overall, because obviously energy efficiency improvements in every sector of our economy is good business, it's good for our environment, it's good for public health. And I think that it's very important for us to think about, as we deal with these challenges coming out of this election, it's important for us to also realize that while we're still reeling and trying to think about all of the things that we don't know, at the same time, the margins in the House and the Senate are a little bit smaller. We have Chris Van Hollen, whom you heard this morning, a new voice in the Senate. There are 4 new terrific women senators that are coming in. What's really critical, I think, is for us to be very vigilant. Obviously, things need to be happening at the state and local level. Those are all important voices. Those are the kinds of voices that as an organization we like to bring in to help educate policymakers and to also talk about solutions. And it is terribly important that we really support the people who are champions, who are supporters, and build new champions, that we make sure that we identify opportunities, that we get them all of the facts, that we find places for them to raise their voices, and that we bring voices in that can help them. And that means also delivering those voices at the state and local level. One of the things that, for example, we will be looking to do is working with the National League of Cities, bringing in the voices of those mayors who care deeply about climate change. They were in Paris, they were again at Marrakesh in terms of talking about that. I think that we can also feel strengthened in our resolve, because after all, this whole day was about Rachel Carson. So we have an obligation to carry that spirit forward. I think our resolve to carry that spirit forward should be strengthened by the fact that the nations of the world came together in terms of Paris. They ratified the Paris Climate Agreement in a record time. That is an incredible, incredible feat. We should not forget that. We should not let down the rest of the world in terms of what we do. We cannot say, well, you know, this happened. We must stand up and fight and show what we stand for. We saw this again in terms of Marrakesh, in terms of the climate implementation discussions that just went on. We saw this in terms of, again, the nations of the world coming together with regard to an amendment to the Montreal Protocol to phase out phase out HFCs, which is very, very important in terms of really making a difference on climate. And we need to remember that all of these things can actually improve our economy, improve our environment, improve public health, and we need to make sure, and Chris Van Hollen said this so well again this morning, that we need to be telling these stories, we need to make them human, put that personal face on these stories in terms of building that case, why it is important, why people should not be selling out their constituencies in terms of health, in terms of water, in terms of air, in terms of clean energy, all of which actually creates jobs, creates the kinds of jobs that people want, that are cleaner, that do not have horrible health implications, and which also are very important in terms of thinking about what this means for global competitiveness. So in terms of some of the other issues that we've been hearing about in terms of the campaign, in terms of the elections, I think our solutions are the ones that are very important in terms of lifting up those areas of the country that have been left behind. We need to hear those voices. We need to raise up those voices. We need to bring forward solutions that work for them, that work for all of us, that work for Rachel Carson's spirit, that work for America. Thank you.
What we're going to do for a few minutes is I'm going to turn on the microphone. There we go. Questions, comments, what do we do? What do you think we should do? Who's right, who's wrong, what's next? Let's try right here, and then we'll...
Question for any of the panelists, but I think particularly for you, Gene. Okay, one of the problems that we've not talked about, one of the elephants in the room is, geez, this whole discussion has been incredibly politicized. How do we depoliticize it?
Politicized meaning Republicans versus Democrats?
I think those are the two parties
That's
out
it,
there.
yeah.
Yeah. Let me
So-
think, yeah. I don't think the Whigs are around anymore.
I'm one of those people that's actually been doing this a long time. And the Clean Air Act of 1990, 26 years ago, passed with 400 votes in the House and 88 votes in the Senate. That bill wouldn't pass today. The vice chair of my board is a former House member, Republican from upstate New York, named Sherry Bowler. He chaired the Science Committee 10 years ago when he retired, which held hearings on climate change. So I don't have there's not a good answer. At the federal level, I honestly believe that the leadership of the Republican Party has been captured by the fossil fuels business. That's who supports their campaigns. Koch brothers weren't around doing that 10 years. Now so they invest heavily. And then half of the Republican Party is the Tea Party. That's where the energy is. And those folks literally are in denial. They're the climate change deniers. And they feed, so the energy from below is from there. And the money is from the industries. That you have a party that's very different than it was even 10 years ago than it is today. There's no Tea Party back then when Cherry was there. So I think it has to start locally. It's not going to be, we have 30 state LCVs around the country. In some of those states, the governors, state legislatures, Republicans and Democrats work together. It's not going to happen because Mitch McConnell and Paul Ryan wake up one day and say, wow, climate change is real, we're going to go solve the problem. So it's going to have to come, in my mind, organizing locally, developing a whole new generation. Because one of the things that gives me most hope is the younger you are, the more you care about climate change. It's more intense the younger you are. And even young Republicans think you're crazy if you think climate change is a hoax. So even younger you are, so there's hope for the future. It's going to be both a youth movement and in the States, but it's going to take a while. It's not easy to want to solve.
Thank you. I think we were all stunned that in the course of the election, climate change virtually went unmentioned. What thoughts do you have about champions in the media? Where in the major media outlets are all of the NGOs and all of the concerned people going to find someone that's going to report on what we've heard today, which was extraordinarily compelling? These stories should be stories on nightly news every day. What media strategy do any of us have?
So that's probably one of the single most. So in 2012, in the presidential elections, there was not a single question on climate. And we thought for sure it's going to happen in 2016. And in fact, in the primaries, both there were a lot of questions, like relatively speaking. There were questions on it. By the time we got to the general, not a single question. So it's just disgusting. We should just stipulate that. We've done campaigns aimed at the media. It's just, I don't have a good answer to it, frankly. I think there's all kinds of media. The good thing is it's not just the network news. The network news did the debates. A lot of other media had this conversation, but we didn't get it into the mainstream media, and there's no excuse for it. We've been calling them out a lot. I think you're just gonna. It is partly generational still on that score as well. But we need to use other media outlets to elevate the story. But it's a frustrating and it's a challenge. And the New York Times writes about it, but so what? Go ahead, Carol.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think there are a variety of things that have to happen, but one of the things, too, is that every time that there, was an appearance in terms of a candidate and things like that, it was really important that we really need people in the audience to be raising the questions so that media will also report on it. So if people are not doing that, and you end up then with political reporters always reporting with regard to a horse race or the latest tweet, then we're not getting the issues covered. So I think that given the different forms of media that are available now, that we all individually have a responsibility and actually have access to use media in a very different way than what had been available before. So I would challenge all of us to do that and to send emails, send tweets, tell people about things that you heard here today, why things are important. Because as I said, we have to really work to bolster our champions, our supporters, create new ones, make sure that state, local, national are all working together, and that we understand how all of these things really do have to work together. But let's us really take now some responsibility, because we do have access to some of these channels.
Thank you. I think a lot of us have had many of our thoughts freshened up by this, what we've heard today. I'm very interested in the direct action of people like me, how you can reach out to people and reach them in terms of their words, their feelings. I'm wondering if the president-elect can't be reached out to. And the words that struck me that Sandra mentioned earlier were mental and climate hero. I think that the president-elect might be very interested in doing something really big. He would like to wear a mantle, and I think he would like to be a hero. And I think there's a possibility that he can be approached on this subject, given those words and that approach.
I've got a whole bunch that were lined up. I'm keeping track. You were next.
I don't really have a question. I think it's an amazing day. But I want to answer to that fellow over there talking about depoliticize. You read this? The very people who are victims are the red state who vote for Trump. How do you depoliticize? And then the other one, the question is, why was an environment a question? You remember in the primary, Governor O'Malley was there. That's when there was discussion. The minute he's eliminated, in the general, there's only Clinton versus Trump. No wonder environmental issues were not even addressed.
I'm going to go all the way to the other end. Toss you the mic. I should have had 6.
Thank you very much. Helen Santiago Fink. I'm a climate researcher working on the international and national level on climate change, particularly with cities on the subnational region, to try to advance and accelerate sustainable urban development as well as climate issues. Just one point on media. The Guardian, the British newspaper, reports regularly on climate issues and sustainability issues. We should have a similar such newspaper here in the US that reports on a regular basis. But I want to speak to the issue of political. Clearly, we need to raise the issue of climate change on the political level. How come, or I'm curious as to what is the thinking about the Green Party in this conversation? They have been taking some strong positions on Standing Rock and some other key issues. Why are they not an active or a serious considered party for this discussion, for advancing the green agenda?
I'm watching Bob about to take our guest. So, I mean, it's a challenge, because obviously they talk about these issues. How many people they can reach is just an open question. People have to make their own judgment on that question. I think that is a challenge with the mainly two-party system we have in this country.